Thank you very much. I hope all the equipment that I'm wearing will be to my advantage and not to your disadvantage, and I hope you'll be able to hear me clearly. I want to thank Wendy and the Humanities Center for bringing me here, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity, as in this case, a cobbler or a shoemaker from Jerusalem, to offer you some insights into the problem of the wandering Jew, not necessarily this one. Towards the end of the 19th century, two notable Russians expressed their astonishment that the Jewish people continued to inhabit the earth, while other nations and people had fallen by the wayside. One was the brilliant novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, the other the distinguished Jewish historian Simon Dubnov. Their remarks provide an introduction into the theme of this presentation. Dostoevsky, who was no great supporter of the Jews, marveled in his diary that they had withstood the trials and tribulations of generations and persisted. It was, he claimed, not merely the product of persecution and will to live that accounted for their unique entity among other cultures and peoples. Rather, their remarkable resistance, their resilience, and tremendous inner strength were a product of an enduring idea of universal meaning and that humanity was still unable to fully comprehend. Dostoevsky left this unresolved, beyond a rational explanation, almost in the realm of a mystical speculation. Several years later, Simon Dubnov developed his theory of national autonomism and wrote on the nature of Jewish nationalism. For Dubnov, Jewish nationalism was different from all others, as it was distinguished by an eternal desire to develop its national entity on a spiritual level, unencumbered by land, territory, or sovereignty. Moreover, Dubnov saw in this situation the expression of a unique development in the course of history, regarding those peoples that continued to exist by virtue of their connection to a particular land and territory as evidence of their less developed and mature identity. Thus, for Dubnov, the ability of Jews to move from one country to another, to uproot themselves time and again, and to adapt to a new cultural setting without ever losing their spiritual moorings, was the highest level a nation could reach, and guaranteed in time and space their eternal existence. This conception lay at the basis of his multi-volume History of the Jews, appropriately entitled World History of the Jewish People. To remain attached to a spiritual goal as one wandered, freed from physical possessions of any kind, was then for Dubnov and for Dostoevsky an indication of the mystery of the Jew. Many others observed the continued presence of the Jews and offered a wide range of explanations, be they economic, historic, theological, social, and cultural, trying to unravel the mystery. The ubiquity of the Jews, a product of their wandering, was often at the heart of these inquiries. Yet the legend of the wandering Jew emerged from different sources and different contexts. In its extensive variations in modern times, one could clearly detect a certain fascination with the fact that this figure, over 1,800 years old, continued to roam the world for so many generations and was still alive. In this sense, the persistence of the legendary wandering Jew in literary and visual sources is intricately related to characteristics attributed to Jewish existence throughout their history, namely migration, penetration into new societies, nomadism, endurance through catastrophic times and crises, homelessness, restlessness, and a problematic relationship to Christ, to the cross, and to Christianity. The interrelationship between these historical phenomena and the legend, and the way they interplay in visual imagination, is at the center of this lecture. Certainly these associations were in the minds of individuals in the 19th and 20th centuries who pondered the meaning of the legend or the historical evolution of the Jews or creatively addressed it. Two examples among many will suffice to illustrate the connections made between the legendary wandering Jew and the historical reality of the Jews. In his work on the emancipation of the Jews in 1840, Joseph Ütves, a well-known Hungarian writer, thinker, and politician, created the analogy between the legendary figure of Ahasver, a name that will reappear in my discussion this evening, who from the 17th century became synonymous with the wandering Jew. Ütves spoke of the connection between this legendary figure and the physical and spiritual state of the modern Jew. The modern Jew's eternal exile, pale face, and dark features, exemplary of his oriental source, loneliness, and lack of honor, conjured up in his mind the legend of the wandering Jew. For him, the Enlightenment philosophy had to bring an end to these negative stereotypes of the Jew and their horrible suffering and result in their emancipation, as their difficult situation represented for him the living legend of the wandering Jew. To the contrary, Werner Sombart, the controversial but distinguished German economic historian, touched on the parallels between Jewish wandering and the legend in his The Jews in Modern Capitalism from 1911. In a chapter devoted to the vicissitudes of the Jewish people, Sombart claimed that centuries of Jewish wandering and insecurity had a definite impact on the Jewish characteristics, affecting their inclination to avoid settling down on the soil. This fate, he argued, was, quote, touchingly expressed in the legend of the wandering Jew. For Sombart, the wandering nature of the Jews fed into their engagement in capitalism, as nomadism is the progenitor of capitalism, so he thought. For others, Jews and non-Jews, wandering was associated with the eternal presence of the Jew. Amidst this flood of associations, the visual representation of the wandering Jew could not be any less diverse in its interpretation. Let us now turn to the basic sources of the legend. This is, of course, a Christian legend, which originated in the Middle Ages and came to full bloom in the 17th century. The original story, he appears as Malchus, a servant of the high priest from John 18:10, or he is Cartaphilus, Pontius Pilate's doorkeeper, or he is sometimes called Butadeus, Botado, none of whom were specifically Jewish. It is only approximately in the around 1500, that the legend begins to become associated with a Jew. At the center of the legend is the encounter between Christ and a Jew in Jerusalem, while Christ was carrying his cross to Calvary. On the road, Christ paused for a moment to rest on the Jew's doorstep, but he was driven away to the cry, "Walk faster." And Christ replied, "I go, but you will walk until I come again." Two themes emerge from this brief but hostile meeting. First, Christ's promise that he will return at some indefinite point of time, before which the victim will know no rest. Second, the indignity with which the Jew treated Christ. Two other legends contributed additional themes to the wandering Jew legend. From the Gospel of John, in the story of Malchus, the offender is punished for having struck Jesus, and he suffers for his insulting behavior. And from the legend of St. John, from the Gospel of St. Matthew, which emphasizes that he will wait and do the will of Christ until the Last Judgment. One other important source before we turn to the visuals. In 1602, an anonymous Lutheran author publishes a work entitled Short Description and Tale of a Jew Named Ahasverus. This is a book which stresses anti-Semitic implications of the story. First of all, we now have a new name to the wandering Jew. He is no longer only Cartophilis, Butadeus, Potato, and so on. He is now also, and never only, he is now also Ahasverus, and he is a cobbler from Jerusalem. One of those who was present at the moment of Christ's crucifixion and called for his crucifixion. He saw him on the way to Calvary and did not let him rest on the doorstep. Jesus doomed him to wander forever or until Jesus' second coming. Jesus says in 1602 in this quotes a Beschreibung, this short description, I will stand here and rest, but you must walk. In a sense, you can see that we have here a representation of the Jew who is exiled from his land and forced to wander, never to return home until they will accept Christ. Their survival as wanderers is a divine sign, proving the justice of the Christian faith. Jewish existence then is understood within Christian faith, and it is clear that there is an influence of an encounter between the theologian Paul von Eitzen, who studied with Luther, as Luther wrote his infamous work, The Jews and Their Lies, in 1543. Now, I will turn off the lights, and we will turn to some of the visuals. And you'll have to bear with me for one moment as we just... Okay. I'm going to show you at first several early images that recapitulate the legend as I have related it to you. Over here, we will see a 13th century image, one of the first which has a reference in some way to our story. It is from the Chronica Maiora from 1259. It's an image of Matthew Paris. And here we see Jesus carrying the cross and is walking. He turns, and as he is walking, he turns to an old decrepit figure who is known as Cartophilis, who leans, as we can see, on a pickaxe, sometimes seen as a symbol of Cain. And two speech scrolls emanate from each of these figures. The speech scroll that emanates from Cartophilis says, "Go on, Jesus, to the judgment prepared for you." The speech scroll which emanates from Christ is, "I am going just as it is written of me, but you will stay waiting until I return." It's interesting that at this stage, it does not mention, "You must wander." The emphasis is that you must remain. Now, in one of the many, many versions of the 1602 document that I spoke of before, we have here an image of Ahasverus standing still, but interestingly, he is wearing a turban. We can't see any of the other appurtenances which are going to become very prominent in the image of the wandering Jew. And on the left, you will see an image from 1616 from a Belgian artist by the name of Adrian Coulert. And here we can already see that something is happening which is merging the story that I have so far revealed to you. We have here in the center the wandering Jew. It is called the portrait done from life of a Jew named Ahasverus, who lives and wanders through the world from the time that Jesus was crucified until the present day. And then we have two scenes in the background. To the far right, we can see that Ahasuerus is standing with his wife and child in front of the house, and as Jesus comes with the cross, he basically tells him, go on. He rejects him. And then later we see that he is on horseback, and he's going into the countryside where he meets two French gentlemen. There too he is without a stick. So these are very early images. This is from 1616, became very, very popular, and it will later appear in many different versions. Over here we're going to see something very interesting, which we're going to later on pick up in the later part of the 19th century. But at the moment, I just want to emphasize this particular logo that we see over here. Because this is a logo which was created by a Jewish printer, a rabbi in Amsterdam, whose name was Menashe ben Israel. And for the first time, we see in 1641 that the printer's mark that he is using, and he will use in several collections, several publications, designed both for Jews and for Marranos, we see that Menashe has chosen an image which is, so to speak, representing himself as his personal logo. And here we can see that the figure is holding a long staff to which a flagon of water is tied. He has very simple clothes, a wide-brimmed hat, short tunic and cloak, knee bridges, stocking and shoes, and he is wearing, of course, a knapsack on his back. It is clear that he is walking through a Christian land. And we have here a Portuguese inscription, and as a Marrano Jew who was very involved in the Marrano world, he wrote in Latin, wrote in Spanish, wrote in Portuguese. The inscription itself is a very interesting one. It says, perceived or understood as a pilgrim. In other words, Menashe says that this pilgrim has a goal. He is not cursed to wander for his crimes. And the question, of course, emerges already. Why does a Jew take on this image of the wanderer and use it for his own logo, in a sense, a kind of self-identification with this figure? It would appear that this is related to much of his activity. He was involved in trying to bring back the Jews to England through his interrelationship with Oliver Cromwell. But more than that, it is associated with his understanding of Messianism. Wandering must precede the coming of the Messiah, an idea that was based on his understanding of two scriptural verses from Daniel from 12:4 and 12:7, which says as follows, and I quote, "But you, Daniel, will keep the words secret and seal the book until the end of time. Many shall wander far and wide, and knowledge will increase. When the dispersion of the holy people shall be completed in all places, then shall all these things, end of days, be completed." In other words, we have here a notion that Menashe identified with the sense of the pilgrim, identifies with the wanderer, and of course sees God's design for the wandering of the Jews to the four corners of the earth as being something significant, a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. Jews as pilgrims united in faith, and the Jews as dispersed and wandering. And it is interesting as one looks through the various books which Menashe publishes in the 17th century, it is clear that there are specific books where he places the logo, and those books are aimed at both Christians and Marranos, those who had returned to Judaism, in his attempt to bring about a larger identification with this notion of wandering. Now, since I've mentioned England, let me turn now to a few images from England, from the 17th and then from the 18th century, to try to show you how this legend is becoming popular in different societies. And I will turn first to a legend, a book, a chapbook published in 1640 called The Wandering Jews Telling Fortunes to Englishmen. Here we see, prior to the return of the Jews to England, something which begins to happen unofficially in the 1650s. It's clear that in the early part of the 17th centuries there was a constant discussion, especially among various religious societies in England, on the necessity or the desire to allow the Jews to return to England. And in this particular chapbook, we have Egremont, an English gentleman who we will see as the figure who stands above the others, an English gentleman who, like many Englishmen of the century, took to travel, reached Venice, whereupon he encountered a Jew. And he was considered by many to be that Jew's double. And therefore Egremont agreed to disguise himself as a Venetian Jew. When he returns to London, he was sought out by various marginal characters who wanted to have their fortunes told. The ruse enables the author to imply that this wandering Jew maintains certain important secrets that bring others to seek him out. And this notion of having the secret of the past, of course the secret that he knows and he has been at Calvary. But here we can say the woodcut only shows us one aspect. It shows us that he is standing in front of this townhouse wearing a long cloak with a badge and a flat beret, but his arrival in this town arouses interest. And he is clearly the other, who the locals believe has some truth to reveal to them. Now, in this chapbook that we see to my immediate right, we have a chapbook from 1720. The wandering Jew, or the shoemaker of Jerusalem, who lived when our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was crucified, and by him appointed to wander until he comes again, with his travels, method of living, and a discourse with some clergymen about the end of the world. Now notice, of course, that we have here a man with a walking stick. He looks somewhat haggard. He's taken a long flight, maybe from Jerusalem. But here I would say that this young man is part of a discussion which takes place in this chapbook for ministers who are all associated with some form of millenarianism. And they had been active, of course, in the struggle for the readmission of the Jews, and they continue to figure prominently in English thought even after the readmission during the period of Oliver Cromwell. In this volume, there is a discussion on the origins of the legend and the insistence on the authenticity. This is something which we will come across again and again, that this is an authentic figure. Once convinced of his existence, the authors had a painter draw his picture, quote, in which he looked neither old nor young, but just as he did 1767 years ago when he began his journey. The King of France, hearing this, wrote for his picture. The work ends in characteristically millenarian style, prophesying the return of all the Jews to Jerusalem, the rebuilding and flourishing of the city, and eventually their conversion. Quote, they and all others shall become Christians, and that wars shall cease, and the whole world live in unity one with another. Not a bad idea. But the wandering Jew will thus cease to wander when he and his kind return to Jerusalem and convert to Christianity. But on my far right, we have something, and here I'm bringing this mostly for a jocular way in which very often the wandering Jew was portrayed. Because if you're looking at this poster to my far right, You will see here it's called The Wandering Jew's Chronicle. And what we do have here is something very surprising. It's the Wandering Jew who is telling us about the history of English rulers, from William the Conqueror to George I. And we have here illustrations of all the English rulers until Queen Anne, and it should be sung according to the tune of The Wandering Jew's Chronicle. It was meant to be, and therefore I have brought it, for mere recreation, to put off vexation. The broadside then does not characterize or provide images of the Wandering Jew. Rather, the Wandering Jew becomes the eternal chronicler who documents the events of the past 100 years of the English crown as one who is present throughout, though, of course, Jews had not been living in England from 1290 from their expulsion. But this has no matter to the creator of the broadside, because we can see that the figure of the Wandering Jew was much more significant in his mind. Now, the one further image that I want to show you of the Wandering Jew in England is, to my far right, the image of a Jew who converted to Christianity. A Christian who converted to Judaism. The figure is Moses Gordon, and this poster is called Moses Gordon, or the Wandering Jew, in the dress he now wears in Newgate in 1788. Here we have the image of a Protestant of Scottish birth. He had been involved in inciting riots known as the Gordon Riots in 1780 against Roman Catholics, against the wealthy aristocracy and the Bank of England, and he was prosecuted for publishing libel against Queen Mary Antoinette. He reappeared in public in the late 1780s as a recent convert to Judaism, probably between 1786 and 1787. And he now observed Orthodox practice since he was in prison. He preferred to be called the leader of the Jews, the traditional title accorded Christ, rather than a humble disciple of Jesus. Gordon appears with straggling, unfortunately I don't have the color image, with straggling reddish hair and an unkempt beard. His behavior and conversion occasioned many ballads, pamphlets, and caricatures, but here he is depicted as an outlandish eccentric, as a spoof of the popular perception of what constitutes a Jew. In the print, then, Moses Gordon, or The Wandering Jew, which was published apparently a month after he was arrested in Birmingham, he appears bearded with long hair, black hat, against the background of several buildings. He is dressed as an Ashkenazic Jew, holding a bag under one arm and some rabbit skins in the other. But why was the association made? Why was the historical association made between Gordon and the legendary Wandering Jew? As you can see from the etching, the occupation of a peddler, rabbit skins and bag, is conflated with the legend of the Wandering Jew. The anonymous artist turned him into a perpetual alien, a theme that was becoming common among English caricaturists of the time. People like Thomas Rowlandson is a perfect example. Gordon, in his new strange guise, becomes identified with the itinerant peddler, already an icon of his fellow Jews, who are understood to lack a sedentary nature and the capacity to assimilate. In this way, he becomes a fulfillment of the biblical prophecy in Acts 19:13, that he will find no rest no matter where he turns. The case of Gordon, then, was rare, as were images of the Wandering Jew in England in general. Possibly, we have because there was an extensive engagement of depicting Jews as itinerant peddlers, the Wandering Jew phenomenon did not resonate. But as it did, we will see immediately in France, as you can see here to my right, where we have in front of us the veritable the portrait of the wandering Jew aged more than 1,800 years ago. And I don't know if anybody is in the room there, if we can possibly focus this and get this a bit sharper. But here you can see that the wandering Jew image in France, which becomes very popular from the end of the 18th century, the notion is that the wandering Jew has arrived in Paris, arrived in France, as this is the promised land. The image often accompanied by a complaint, a lyric lament that originated in France in the early 17th century and was circulated in various versions. Its more prominent themes touched on the nature of the wandering Jew and his physical appearance. It describes, and this is the lament that we see on both sides of the image, it describes the wandering Jew as an individual with 5 sous in his pockets, 5 cents in his pocket, corresponding to the 5 injuries inflicted on Christ, who always wore unkempt shoes, not Christ, and clothes. On his travels, he would encounter respectable individuals, as we will see low down over here, and who are struck by his appearance, in particular his extraordinary long beard, and engage him in conversation, try to coax him to join them in drink, but he refuses, claiming that he is committed to travel. Through the complaint, we can see that wherever the Jew comes, he can speak the language of the local people. There is longevity, and therefore we know that he has wandered. And here, in this particular case, the alleged visit of the wandering Jew took place in Brussels on April the 22nd, 1774, at 6 o'clock, an event which was recorded only in 1800. Sold for small sums by merchants and peddlers as broadsheets and in chapbooks, which often added a touch of the supernatural in the text. The complaint was later put to song, read aloud in France, and translated into other languages, including Flemish, and for our introducer, into Danish, Dutch, and other languages. But notice the scenes in the background. The scenes in the background tell us the story. Here we have the shopkeeper or the shoemaker. Then we have Christ with the cross going to Calvary. And then we have the meeting with the respectable individuals. From there, we can say that the wandering Jew phenomenon is going to take off. And it will take off in various contexts in France in the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the people who was most important in this dissemination was the publisher Pellerin, a publishing company in Epinal, which had been famous for doing theological figures, but after the French Revolution turned, as he was a deist himself, involved in Freemasonry, began to disseminate in wide numbers the image of Napoleon, who he saw in many ways as being a figure who could bring a new vision to France. And this, even after Napoleon dies, it's clear that Pellerin sees that Napoleon can be one of the most popular images that people in France are interested in purchasing. But at some point, he turns to one of the artists who had worked for him, François Georgin. And Georgin does, in 1826, one of the most important images of the wandering Jew. And as you can see here, we no longer have the story. We no longer see Christ in Calvary. We no longer see him being rebuked. The figure takes on an internal meaning of someone who can go on, walk through countries, pass through time, pass through moments of catastrophe, and walking very sturdily. And we see here his attributes: the walking stick, the tunic, Here he has the Oriental turban, and we see him next to the ship. In a later version, you will see here that we have some allusion to Calvary, the three crosses. And this is something which we're going to have to keep in mind as we go on, that sometimes we are being reminded of the moment, and sometimes the figure himself becomes so attractive, almost like a talisman, someone who can help people get used to the new moment after the revolution. And therefore, I would say that we have here a very interesting way in representing the Wandering Jew as being a kind of gentleman figure who does not arouse any sense of, there's no anti-Semitic motivation here, at least not in my interpretation. And I would say that Georgin is capitalizing on the pagan and para-Christian practices in regional France, that they are interested in coming across the immortal figure of the Wandering Jew, and almost in the way that Napoleon had been for many of them. And I'm going to show you two other images just to give you a sense of, and this is an endless amount of material, and I can only show you a bit of it. Over here you can see the Wandering Jew is dressed much more elegantly. He comes to a town, and he is told where he's supposed to move on. Here we do have the physiognomic character of a hook nose, but we see that he has this little purse with the 5 sous, his walking stick, but his shoes are well-dressed shoes. In the background, though, we do see some memory of the event, whereas on the far right, you can see a 19th century Epinal image where people are coming to see the Wandering Jew, and here's the Wandering Jew with his long beard. They want to engage him in conversation. They want to take him for a drink in the regional bar. And at the bottom, of course, you can see that the lyrics of the complaint are added. So these images, very popular, are not expensive. People buy them and put them on in their rooms. And then all of a sudden something breaks open. And this comes as a result of a serialized novel in France in the 1840s by Doré Sue called The Wandering Jew. And in that particular novel, it is a serialized popular novel which is extremely popular throughout the 19th and the 20th century, where we see that Doré Sue, who was very much of a liberal figure, takes on the image of Ahasver as being an important liberal figure, someone with a social message, and that person is personified as someone who will tackle fundamentalist beliefs, especially those of the Jesuits. And therefore, I would say that at the same time that the Epinal images are becoming popular, we have the literary image which is giving further strength, and then comes Gustave Doré. Now, Gustave Doré, whose work many of you may know through his illustrations of The Ancient Mariner, Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and his very, very elegant Bible, which he does also in the 1850s. His series becomes extremely important. That is a series that we will see on both sides. But at the moment, first, I want you to take a look at something which he does before the series, which he does in 1852. And this is probably one of the most striking images, and here I would say a very clear anti-Semitic image, where you can see that he brings together several notions of who this wanderer is. On the one hand, he is walking with the sign of Cain. He has the hook nose, which emerges in English caricature in the 18th century. He has this huge red hair, the devilish, you can see the demons in the background as he is walking through territory. Now this appeared in a small journal called Le Journal de Rire, a journal of laughter in 1852. And interestingly enough, Doré does not continue this spirit in doing The Wandering Jew, though it is later picked up and becomes the frontispiece of a very important collection of anti-Semitica, not done with the motivation of illustrating or disseminating anti-Semitic imagery, done by an important German scholar, Eugene Fuchs, in 1923. But then I want us to turn, and I'm going to have to do this very quickly, to look at some of the Doré images that we're going to see on both sides. It is clear that for Doré, what we have is a series in which, I'm not sure, are you seeing this well focused? Is it possible for you to maybe to focus this one? I think this one is better focused. Throughout the engravings in the series, Doré brings back the moment of the cross, brings back the moment of the crucifixion. And we can see that the Wandering Jew is constantly facing in a phantasmagoric reflection the cross, Christ. He is, to a certain extent, he is wandering through time, through monuments, through space, through countries, through hills, through water, through land, and he's trying, and he continues to survive in both cases. And you can see here, once again, he is being met by a group of individuals who want him, thank you very much, who want him to engage him in conversation as he comes into a particular town. There you can see him going through different lands, also in a very phantasmagoric way. Snakes. He is basically going through time. He is growing older and older, and yet nothing phases him. While helpless vessels sink before his eyes, trees intertwined with snakes, eventually he will reach, as we will see in a moment, here he is going through the wreckage of ships and he can still survive. And here we will see him eventually, and you can see him facing the cross as he's going through these countless moments. And there you're going to finally see him coming to his judgment day. That is, in the climax to his wandering, he is finally sitting amidst an array of skeleton bones, animals, demons, attending to the purgatory fire, guards, as he hears the sounds of trumpets announcing the end of his wandering as the day of judgment, the day of redemption has come. So each and every one of Doré's images were reproduced in various media, and their impact upon the development of the visual interest was extensive. But not everybody was pleased with this form of the depiction of the Wandering Jew. And here to my right, you can see that Gustave Corbet, in a very fascinating painting entitled The Meeting, documents a meeting between his patron, Alfred Bruyat, with the latter's servant and dog. And it's clear that what Corbet is doing is moving away from the phantasmagoric associations that we have in the Doré series, probably influenced by somebody who was very close to Corbet and tried to bring him into popular imagery, who wrote on popular imagery in France in the 18th century, Champfleury. And Corbet admired folklore, valued its contribution to popularizing social thought, and here he feels that the popular imagery had a certain charm and thoughtfulness into the nature of people. And here you can see an image which is clearly a source for Corbet's meeting. Now, this encounter, as Linda Nochlin has, to my mind, very astutely noticed, this encounter with the wandering Jew merges with the artist, the notion of the artist as a wanderer, with a mission, like Ahasver in Eugène Sue's account, who encounters on the road his patron to whom he speaks his mind. And Nochlin remarks at that point that one can regard here the wandering Jew as a portrait of the artist, as a portrait of Corbet, as a free man. And that is, we now have a new interpretation of the wandering Jew. He became a marker of attachment to popular culture, yet he can also be seen as the portrait of the artist as a free man. Now, I'm going to have to move ahead and skip some of these images that I wanted to show you, because I want to come to something which, to my mind, is very significant in terms of what I've been showing you. And I want to turn to the image to my immediate right, and if you can focus this, it would help, of Wilhelm von Kaulbach. Because Wilhelm von Kaulbach, in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Emperor Titus in 1846, a painting which was commissioned by Ludwig of Bavaria, this was unprecedented. I would say never before was the legendary figure integrated into such a major work of art, and never before was the visual image granted such a clear anti-Jewish connection. You're going in the wrong direction. And what is important here to see that Kaulbach, a known historical painter, describing the destruction of Jerusalem, and it can still be seen today in the Neue Pinakothek in Munich, which was inaugurated in 1853, and gave this painting a very special pride of place, I would say. The painting, for which the artist wrote a detailed explanation, focus on the destruction of Jerusalem, bringing together the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And here we see that Kaulbach dramatically depicts the destruction and burning of the city, and at the same time shows the entry of the Romans into Jerusalem. And at the center, you will see here that the high priest is committing suicide. And at the lower left, you can see three demons who are pushing or expelling the wandering Jew from Jerusalem, who is, on the one hand, being expelled from Jerusalem, and he is also being posited against this very, very serene Christian family on the opposite side. That is, the wandering Jew who escapes the burning city can now be seen that the wandering Jew is not only the antithesis to the Christian family, but he is also taking on I would say, a kind of medieval image where we have synagoga on one side and ecclesia on the other side. And therefore Kaulbach is commenting to us that the meaning of this historical painting, that was a judgment which God intended and carried out. The historical religious painting then was a powerful work with a significant new statement of the wandering Jew. Jews and Judaism had been defeated, and they were replaced by Christianity. For Kaulbach, the implication was clear. The wandering Jew was a personification of the Jew throughout history. Now, this is one side of a story, but if I go on for another 5 minutes, I want to show you that other elements are constantly being brought into this story. And here we have images created by a student of Jean-Martin Charcot at Salpêtrière in France. Here we have the restlessness and nomadism that became identified with the wandering Jew and central to anti-Semitic iconography, taking on a psychopathological twist by the psychiatric school. That is, Jewish nervousness is a sickness. It is a form of traveling insanity. It is akin to, quote, somnambulism provoked by hypnosis. Charcot presented one such figure in a clinical case in 1889. He showed a person who suffered from pains in his leg, extreme exhaustion, and excessive frugality to his audience, and remarked that this person is a descendant of Ahasverus or Cartophilius. A person driven, he said, by an irresistible need to change his surroundings, to travel, without being able to settle down anywhere. Now, Charcot's lead was pursued by his student Henri Mege, who received a dissertation in 1893 when he set out to study the neuropathology of Le Juif errant, of the Wandering Jew. Mege pursued both the historical origins of the legend and added several images that he regarded as a valuable form of a medical point of view. He argued that their neuropsychological studies proved the existence of a Jewish pathology that expressed itself in the form of a nervous, insatiable need to travel. Secondly, the Jew's image and gaze were consistent with such a condition. Thirdly, and central to our concerns, Mege analyzed the series of illustrations of the Wandering Jew, including some of those from the Epinal, and claimed repeatedly that they reflected reality and showed, quote, that the artist rendered reliably and naively the expression of his model. To do so, he claimed, the artist must have obviously observed the model. Indeed, Mege compared the clinical patients at Salpêtrière with the images, several of which he drew himself. His comparison produced the remarkable conclusion. The remarkable conclusion was that the Wandering Jew of the legend and the Wandering Jew of the clinics are but one and the same type. A neurotic traveler, interminable wanderer, who appears one day and disappears the next, following shortly another who resembles him in every manner, a Jew who wanders around the world lamenting and gasping. Mege had then moved the eternal wandering of the Jew from the theological to the medical realm, adding another link to the growing contemporary literature on anti-Semitism and disease. Folk legend had proposed a supernatural explanation of what was in reality a medical condition. In this way, Charcot and Mege furthered their design to undermine clerical and historical explanations of the eternal Jew. Now, I must conclude, though I have brought, unfortunately, more material than I should have. And let me just say that I'm leaving out, unfortunately, the assumption by Jewish artists in the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century of how they then see themselves. They take the Wandering Jew image and turn it on its head. And they see this as a way, they reconstruct the image in order to take out its Christological, often they take out the Christological meanings in order to give it a more identificatory association. Thus, the range of, and I will conclude with this general remark, the range of the visual material relating and treating the Wandering Jew illuminates a repeated invocation of the legend during the last 200 years. Caricaturists, artists, artisans, sculptors, and craftspeople of different persuasion and cultural backgrounds were intrigued by the legend and the figure and incorporated him in a myriad of ways into their compositions. His presence was ubiquitous. A true folk hero, he could be found on popular broadsheets, labels for Bittermouth and an aperitif tonique, or for El Judeo Erranta, a name brand of Havana cigars, as an ex libris a small statuette, a board game with the figures from Sue's famous novel on ceramic plates, etc. He could clearly appeal to different audiences, move more or less familiar with the legend, and provoke humor, sarcasm, anger, affection, and wonder. Yet he could also be found in paintings and sculpture that developed the symbolism associated with the legend into areas that mirror the problematic of Jewish life in modern society. As such, I would claim, The Wandering Jew brings us back into just one moment. As such, The Wandering Jew can be then seen as an anvil upon which political, theological, social, and personal ideas and ideals could be designed and refashioned. The medieval myth had indeed become a modern metaphor for Jews and Jews alike. Thank you very much.